This podcast is brought to you by the School of Advanced Study, University of London.
Today's talk at the Institute of Historical Research Latin American History seminar. We're delighted to welcome today Manuel Barcia from the University of Leeds. He needs no introduction, but I will introduce him nonetheless. He's a professor in Hispanic studies, but mainly Latin American history.
Yeah.
Okay, Latin American history.
It doesn't matter.
You said it too many times. And he's also currently having a Philip Leverhulme Prize. He's on sabbatical for 2 years working on new projects. But now he is going to be presenting on what was his latest book that came out with Past and Present in Oxford University Press, West African Warfare in Bahia and Cuba, Soldiers, Slaves in the Atlantic World, 1807 to 1844. So, with no further ado, all right.
Okay, thank you so much. I like this kind of seminars actually. They are like cozy and not overcrowded. If more people come, then it's going to get trickier. So I'm going to be talking about my last book. Hopefully not the last one, my most recent book. You don't know. I might quit this at some point. So, I've been working on the history of African slavery in the Americas for a few years now. I'm not going to say how many. And one thing has led to another, and I ended up writing this book as a result of my previous research. So basically, I started working on slave resistance. I actually started working on resistance and moved to slave resistance in Cuba mostly. And that one thing led to another. I realized that in order for me to understand what I was studying, I needed to understand better the history of the people I was studying. It's been very common, and I'm going to mention this a couple of times throughout this presentation, that we rely too much on Western, and when I say Western I mean American and European methodologies, terminologies, vocabulary, everything that everything else you want to throw in the bag in order to understand societies and events and characters who were not Western. And I think it's a very important thing that we try to redress this issue. And for me, this was a good opportunity to do that. To be honest with you, I have been a little bit upset with this for a while. It's not just that I'm doing this as an academic endeavor, it's that I'm also pissed off about it. Oh, I'm recording there. The reason I have been upset with this is because, especially when it comes to African people, but this also happens to Latin American peoples, I mean, to indigenous populations in the Americas, and even to Asian people who ended up in the Americas as well. Usually they are sort of ignored or underestimated, not only them, but also their actions, their thinking, their behaviors, etc., etc. They are underestimated, and usually they are interpreted and they're examined, interpreted, and translated through this Western way of looking at things in general. This may sound a little bit simple, but basically what I wanted to do with this book was to show that Africans actually existed, that they were not an illusion of slave owners and slave traders in the Americas. Now I'm going to get back to this point at some point. So very important here is, for me as an Atlantic historian, was a need of incorporating African history into the history of America. So the areas I am looking at are Cuba and Brazil. Let me know. Sorry, Anyway, the areas that I'm looking at are Brazil and Cuba. These are the two areas where I specialize, but I am actually looking at the African diaspora in a very specific period of time in Brazil and Cuba. So because I'm looking at the African diaspora, I'm really studying the history of the Africans who went to these places. They're not so much studying anymore the history of these places, but the history of African populations. And we are talking here about men, women, children who were born and mostly raised in African societies, different African societies. When I say Africa or African at times, please bear with me because it just comes out of my mouth. I don't mean it like that. There is no such a thing as the African society or African people, but sometimes it makes the narrative easier, and I'm very aware of that, and so I just I'm apologizing about that before. So I'm looking at this phenomenon, African diaspora in the Asian Revolution. So to lay out what I've done, so that you can start figuring out what I'm talking about and stop rambling. I'm trying to do two things with this book. One of them is to make sure that the Asian Revolution, which has been defined by theories, methodologies that originate in Europe and the Americas, and it has been defined as well by events, historical events that take place in the Americas or in Europe, and we are talking here about the American Revolution of 1776, the French Revolution of 1789, the Haitian Revolution of 1791, the Latin American revolutions from the 1810s, 1820s, the European revolutions in 1830 and 1848. All these events take place in Europe and or the Americas. When we talk about the Asian Revolution in the Atlantic world, and when we are talking about this Atlantic world that is now in the 19th century more and more connected thanks to the introduction of steam engines, and navigation is much more faster because of different technological innovations as well. Basically, this is an Atlantic world that, because it's connected like that, an event that takes place, say, in Poland may have repercussions in another place, say, in Buenos Aires. It's very common that these things happen. However, when we talk about this Atlantic world and about the Asian Revolution in this Atlantic world, the one element that is usually missing there is the African component, it's the African element. And we talk about African slave revolts or African resistance or whatever, but it's just kind of it's a very simplistic and superficial way of treating the real contribution of the Africans to the Atlantic world in this period. The other issues I'm trying to engage with as well it relates to a theory that has been developed many years ago about what happened to these African men, women, and children when they crossed the Atlantic. And some people have claimed that they actually they lost their agency, they lost everything, to the point that this theory, which was coined, this term was coined by Orlando Patterson. It refers to these African people going through a process of social death. So I'm actually, because they are actually dispossessed of all who they were. They are socially dead. I'm actually trying to position myself on the other side of the spectrum and showing that there is more of continuity and rupture in the Middle Passage, and I'm trying to demonstrate that with events that take place on the other side of the Atlantic after the Middle Passage. And I use slave rebellions, which are the center of my study, because they are extraordinary events. And extraordinary events usually produce, extraordinary documents. Okay? And this actually allows to have an in-depth look at how these people behave once they cross Atlantic, what kind of world they found there, and what kind of integration and behavior they develop. So I actually look at this, but the main problem that I had to deal with from the beginning was that slave rebellions both in Brazil and in Cuba, unlike in the United States, although even in the United States this is a problem, have been studies of slave rebellions have been limited. In the case of Cuba, there are two events that have taken most of the scholarship, which are the Aponte Rebellion of 1812 and the La Calera Conspiracy of 1844. In the case of Brazil, more specifically in Bahia, is the Malay, of the Muslim rebellion, usually called like that, but it's not really a Muslim rebellion, of 1835. When in reality we are talking about around 100 more that are barely known. Actually, I wrote my previous book was about one of them, the 1825 rebellion in Cuba. So at some point, when I'm talking about these events, I am actually going to stop calling these events with this name of rebellion, and I'm going to start calling them something else, but you have to wait a little bit to get there. So, right. This is something that I actually probably should mention for now. Brazil and Cuba, if you look at the map, obviously they don't seem like the classic or the ideal candidates to be compared. Cuba is a really tiny island if you compare the size of Brazil, but in reality I'm not comparing Cuba with Brazil. I'm actually comparing two plantation areas. One of them was around the cities of Havana and Matanzas in Cuba. The other one was around the cities of Bahia in Brazil. So these are really limited, geographically speaking, they are limited spaces. And the reason I decided to compare these two is because in the 19th century, once the British abolished the slave trade and they put into place abolitionist policies in the Atlantic, the only two places in the Americas that continued to import African slaves in large numbers, indeed in larger numbers, are Brazil and Cuba. And in the case of both Bahia and the western part of Cuba, many of these Africans are going to come from the same region in West Africa. As a matter of fact, West Africans are going to be one of the two main groups that are going to arrive in this place. So this, to put it in really, really simple terms, these are going to be the same people. Okay? Same people going to these two places. Now these people, as it happened, as a matter of fact, they were all coming from a region that was deeply affected by warfare at the time. In these regions, let me see if I can do something with this. It's this area over here. I'm going to show you another map now. There was a jihad going on since 1804, the jihad of Usman Danfodio. It was a millenarist movement, Mahdist movement as well. But there were also a number of developments that they were not directly related to the jihad that were also affecting these people. There were other civil wars going on, there were internal and external wars, there were new states that were emerging, and most of the people who are going to make their way to Cuba and Brazil, they are what we call Yoruba, which are coming from roughly the areas of what is today Togo, Benin, and southwest Nigeria. But these people are going to come from what it once was a blossoming empire that in the late 18th century is going to start a period of decadence that is eventually going to lead to a collapse of the empire. It's going to lead to a collapse because it's going to be to suffer invasions from the Dahomey, which is a racing empire in what is today roughly the Republic of Benin. It's going to suffer the invasion of the jihadis from the north, and it's also going to undergo a civil war, an internal civil war. All this is going to affect the enslavement patterns in this area. And this is going to combine with the implementation of abolitionist policies of the British in the Atlantic, and it's going to create a whole new dynamic of enslavement and the slave trade that is going to change basically the way the slave trade was carrying out. This is something that has been discussed, but it's not always recognized among historians who are looking at these events. So, these people that go to Bahia and Cuba, they are all going to be affected by warfare. They were familiar with warfare, and this is a very important aspect that I'm trying to raise. Many of them were soldiers, and notice that I'm actually using the word soldier, not warrior. These people belong to organized armies. These were not unorganized, disorganized, primitive armies, to call them somehow in another way. These were well-organized armies that have very clear organizational and strategical patterns. So even those who were not soldiers, still they had a direct relationship with warfare. So these people are going to be taken across Atlantic, and they are going to be dumped on plantations or cities on the other side of Atlantic. And of course, this is going to have consequences, because these people are coming or crossing the Atlantic with a serious knowledge of warfare. As a matter of fact, we usually refer to them as slaves, which is obviously in this case is a Western term. Western slave traders, slave owners, authorities in countries in the Americas and Europe call them slaves. But if you think about it, to a certain extent, they were first and foremost prisoners of war. And there is one thing that is very important here that also is usually overlooked. None of them, not one of them have been defeated in the battlefield by white men. They have all been defeated by fellow Africans. Okay? So usually, and when we get to this part, I'm going to come back to this. Usually, historians have assumed that African slaves in the Americas would be intimidated by the power, the prowess of exhibited by slave systems in the Americas. But in reality, there is no real reason to believe that. Not at the beginning, anyway. One thing that is very important here as well is that the history of these areas in West Africa is very badly understood, because the historical sources that we have to understand it are scarce. There are some new sources coming up now, mostly written in Arabic and Ajami, but the sources left by Europeans in this period are really poor. Actually, the missionary societies start going to West Africa in the 1820s, seriously, to get into the interior of Africa, and there are a few European travelers like Henry Clapperton or the Lander brothers or Mungo Park even before, that actually get into the interior, but this is not that common, and obviously they are European observers, so their take on what is happening over there has to be always taken with a pinch of salt. Interesting bit here, and this is kind of a byproduct of this research, is that the sources referring to these people on the other side of America, especially on the other side of Atlantic, especially in Brazil and Cuba, are going to be the exact opposite. And the reason for that is because the Spanish and the Portuguese and the Brazilians, they were obsessive, compulsive bureaucrats. They would write down everything. And these sources from the Americas, when these extraordinary events take place, these revolts take place, there are long and detailed trials and records that describe very well what these people were about. And usually, you're never going to get 100% the voice of the subaltern here, to use Spivak's words, but usually they get to tell their story. Sometimes you realize that the person who is transcribing the story is using formula, and you know that it's being manipulated, the testimony is being manipulated, but in some other cases you can tell that the person, the secretary who is recording the story, is actually using the inflections, the words that these people are using, because you can barely read it, because it seems like a Creole language. It's not Spanish or Portuguese, because they are recording African words the way these people are telling them. And obviously, you also have to deal with a translator in between. Very often they have a translator, obviously. So this is a byproduct that I just wanted to mention this. There is a byproduct in this research, which is the opportunity of adding new information to the history of these West African regions by reading and examining sources created in the Americas. Okay, I'm going to go back a little bit to what an African historian, John Thornton, has referred to as the invisibility of Africa, or the historical blindness toward Africa. There are different ways of putting it. And it refers to the underestimation of the contribution of the Africans to the Atlantic war in the 19th century. And in general, this continues to happen until today. There is still an implicit backwardness associated with Africa. And that is reproduced on TV, it's reproduced on newspapers, it's reproduced on the internet, you can find it anywhere. And the reason this happens is because still we continue to follow the same discourse that was generated by no other than the authorities and the planters and the slave traders. So what happened here is that we have continued to use terms and vocabulary that were coined by the people who were oppressing these people, the Africans. Okay? It's very simple. There hasn't been any kind of any attempt of challenging these categories. There hasn't been any attempt of challenging this vocabulary. We continue to reproduce it from the 19th century or even before. They are using words that you would think they are politically incorrect, and we don't challenge them. The Americans actually have done so. They have challenged words like negro or nigger, or they have actually challenged things. In Spain, in Spanish or in Portuguese, it hasn't been done. But even in English, even the Americans still continue to reproduce many other words. These are the obvious ones, the ones that they target, but there are many other words that they haven't been challenged. So obviously, you need to start somewhere. You need to start trying to understand what was happening in Africa or in these African regions at the time. So you need to submerge yourself into African history, and because this is the only way you're actually going to understand what the actions of these men, women, and children meant on the other side of the Atlantic. Otherwise, what we do is to continue to examine these actions through the same Western lens. If you don't understand what's happening in West Africa, you cannot understand what these people were doing in the Americas. It's that simple. You cannot just say these people were Africans, they had an African background. This is what everybody has said. But in reality, it doesn't change our understanding of the issues, of what these people were actually doing. The complexity of the history of these West African regions is just mesmerizing. Just to put you an example, and I always actually, I've given this presentation a few times, and I always make a point of making mention of this, and even more now that we have the episode 7 coming out of Star Wars. The Empire of Oyo, if you read the history of the Empire of Oyo, you read everything that is written on the Empire of Oyo, you will come to the same conclusion that I have come to. Because I have actually discussed this with colleagues. It resembles increasingly more and more Star Wars. I mean, the Empire and the Republic and the senators and all these intrigues, the palace intrigues, and the guy trying to take power from the other guy and backstabbing the other guy, and then this other guy sending an army over there and making an alliance with the other guy. You actually get this feeling that is so complex, it's so complicated that even with information in front of you, you still struggle to understand what's happening, what's going on, and who is supporting who at every moment. Plus, it's not just a matter of military alliances in search for power. There is religion as well involved here, especially Islam. That should not be overlooked. So, one thing that is very important that I should mention here is that Europeans and in general authorities in Cuba and Brazil and in the rest of the Americas, wherever there were African slaves, they tend to underestimate slave revolts, and there is one key argument that they always use, and it refers to the size. As a matter of fact, if you look at the Haitian Revolution, it starts as a small revolt, okay, and it turns into a revolution over years. But anyway, they always assume that small warfare, the small army, is a show, and historians right now are writing this, by the way. It's a sign of weakness, it's a sign of not understanding what to do. They assume that if movements are not really revolutionary according to European standards, they are not really that meaningful. And I have got this, by the way. But always we come back to the same argument that, okay, these were 12 people. Okay, these were 40 people. Okay, these were, 17 people. This could not lead anywhere. As a matter of fact, they could not be more wrong than that. In West Africa, and I'm going to put you an example, is not by any chance the only one. I can actually mention about 20, 30 examples from this period, but the one example that stands out more than any other is actually Usman Dan Fodio Jihad that is going to transform all this territory, and territory that you cannot see in this map. Okay? It's going to create the Sokoto Caliphate. this movement starts in 1804 with a small group of men who run away from one of the Islamic states in this area, the Emirate of Gobir. These people run away because they are being oppressed, they reorganize, they attack, and they are defeated twice, and they are defeated big time in what is today the Republic of Niger. Big time, and yet still they reorganize again, they beat the army of Gobir, and little by little, this bunch of guys who were, 16 if I recall well at the beginning, they grow and grow and grow, and they become the largest state in the area within 6 years. So this is the same experience that these men, women, and children are having all across this region. So to them, something that started small did not necessarily mean or meant that it would lead to failure. As a matter of fact, if you look at Oyo, another one of the important states in this area, the way you would organize an army, you would not call the army. People would not come and all go under the banner of the emperor or Alafin, which is his real name. What will happen is that in every town, in every village, you will have a captain. They were called Bales. In Hausa territories, they were called Hakimi. And these Bales, they would raise a small army. They would actually have to create, to find their own weapons. They would raise a small army within a day or two, and then they would go and all join together into the army of the Alafin. And this will lead obviously to large military campaigns. But they would start small again, and they would actually get their own weapons. And the reason I'm saying this is because when we go on the other side of the Atlantic, this is what's going to happen. When we talk about slave rebellions, usually they start small, but they are usually, very frequently anyway, dismissed by historians because they were small. They didn't have a real objective. And this, as I said before, relates to the fact that, and here is when I'm going to make this point, to all this idea of the social debt. It relates to the fact that there is this misconception that African men, women, and children, when they cross the Atlantic, they stop being who they were. And this is not right. For several reasons, it's not right. It's not right for basic reasons. For instance, these people are going to go from one West African region in which, it's a tropical region. They are going to go to two tropical regions on the other side of the Atlantic. So the world, the natural world they are going to find, not that different. For starters, still they are going to have the polar star to guide themselves, the same constellations, and constellations for West Africans, like for any other people in the world in this period, when there was not electric light, are going to be very important. They would determine when the crops were made, they would determine basically everything, when the festivals would take place, when to procreate, million things. But also you have temperature, humidity, atmospheric pressure, stuff that normally you wouldn't think of, but they are very important because they allow them to relate to their new environments in ways like, for instance, somebody coming from Sweden wouldn't have related to. A Swedish guy in the tropics would sweat a lot and probably would die soon. These people, they had the opportunity to reproduce their life to a certain extent as well, not only because of that, but say, for instance, the Yoruba, they would worship Shango. Shango is the god of thunder, right? You all live in the UK, so how often do you hear the thunder here? Thunderstorms? Rarely. These people going to Bahia and to Cuba would see thunderstorms all the time, so they could still continue the worship. Shango was present, okay? As it was Yemanja in the rivers, and the same goes with animals that were familiar to them and plant genera that was familiar to them, because both Brazil and Cuba had formed part at some point until the Jurassic period of a West Gondwana supercontinent that split up in this period, and there are plant genera that can be what's the word for that? You can use similar plants to replace the ones that they had used in Africa for medicinal purposes or whatever purpose. And this is not the only one. This is not the only thing actually. If you think about it, this is the 19th century we're talking about. a lot of African species have crossed Atlantic to the Americas, and a lot of American species have crossed Atlantic towards Africa. So the world is not really that dissimilar. It's more of a known than an unknown, especially for those who go to the countryside. And there are other things as well that make them that make you think that there are more continuities than real ruptures. And it is also the fact that these people are going to go to societies, both in Bahia and in Cuba. Many of them are going to end up in cities, and these West African people, especially the Yoruba, they were supposed to be, or this is what the historiography tells us anyway, I have to rely on what I read, they were the most heavily urbanized people in West Africa at the time. So these were men, women, and children who grew up surrounded by fellow human beings. They were not isolated in the middle of the countryside. And this is very important as well to look into this. So these people made it across Atlantic, and we are told by historians that they rebel. We are told by historians that they revolt, that they kill their masters, their overseers, sometimes at sea, like in the case of the Amistad. So how we interpret that? And usually what happened is that we have assumed that these slaves, they were either under the influence of Atlantic ideologies, and when I say Atlantic ideologies, I basically mean European and or American ideologies. French Revolution, Haitian Revolution, so we're truly revolutionary, and this is what we are led to believe, that only truly revolutionary events are actually worth studying. In reality, try to think about this. In reality, most of these slave revolts that take place in both territories in the first half of the 19th century, they are led and formed by African men and women and children who had just arrived. Most of them have been less than a year, many of them less than a month on the other side of Atlantic. Often they revolted as soon as the shackles came off their hands and feet. So these people, they did not speak Portuguese or Spanish. They had a very limited knowledge at the time of what was going on around them. And they definitely didn't have a lot of understanding. I'm not going to say completely they didn't have any understanding, but they had very little understanding of what was happening in other parts of the Americas or in Europe at the time. Okay? Even if they did, this would be quite limited. They are going to take arms and they are going to fight against their masters. Now, because they did not follow Atlantic revolutionary ideologies, that doesn't mean their actions were less important. For starters, they were following ideologies from their homelands that were also revolutionary. And the Jihad of Yudman and Fodio, to put you with one example, was a revolutionary movement. So these people are going to follow, they're going to organize in ways they know, and they're going to carry their actions in ways they know. So here is what I had the epiphany when I was writing this stuff. When they are interviewed, they are always being led. Okay? So say you have a prosecutor, and the prosecutor is going to ask them, so why did you rebel? Why did you join this insurrection? Why did you revolt? They would always use these words because to them, this is what they are doing. They are rebelling against the status quo, against the system. The answers of the Africans, on the other hand, are very revealing. They hardly ever reply with the same words. The word they use, time and again, even when they are being led, when they are not led, it's even clearer, is war, making war. They use the word war. Constantly, continuously, repeatedly, always they use the word war. And they could have chosen not to. It doesn't matter whether they are using an interpreter, it doesn't matter whether they were really capable of speaking a bit of Spanish or Portuguese, still they are going to reply with the word war. To these people, these slave revolts, slave insurrections, etc., were really actions of war, as they understood them. obviously, for somebody like me, it's very difficult to understand how they understood the actions of war, for any of us, as a matter of fact. But this is the way they are looking at things. Okay? So, and they could have easily followed the lead of the prosecutors. It would have been very simple. Sorry. So there are a number of things that that are very pertinent to discuss right now, and this is the last part of the presentation, and it is how did they organize themselves, okay? In general terms, and this involves organization and strategy, this involves leadership and loyalties, this involves how military operations were carried and what kind of tactics they employ, they involve who joined every movement, what kind of people would join and what kind of people would leave as well, and also what kind of weapons and war paraphernalia they would use. So this, I'm going to finish with this. I'm not going to bother you with this, but I think that it's very important that a few things are said here. For starters, the way they recruit people, well, let's start with organization and strategy. The first thing historians have claimed about all these African movements is that they were not well organized, among other reasons because they were small. Because they didn't have real aims, they didn't have real objectives as they should be perceived from a Western point of view. If you don't know what you're going to do next, you are not well organized. If you don't know what you're going to do next, you are not well organized. And this is quite funny because right now we are about to start bombing Syria and we don't know what's going to happen afterwards, if you think about it. And so we did with Iraq, with Somalia, etc., etc. So it's not like we are that wise anyway. But this is what we are led to believe. If they were not able to say, oh, we wanted to take the cities and create a government, then they were not well organized and they didn't have a plan. No, they did have plans. The way that they explain their plans and the plans are transcribed may lead to confusion, I admit that, but that doesn't mean they didn't have follow-up plans. When they say very often that they wanted to go to the land of the blacks, Tierra de Negros, Terra de Negros, or Terra de Pretos, usually they may have referred to different things. They may have referred to going to the mountains and start living over there, like many of them actually did, or they may have referred to go to the ports and taking a ship and going back to Africa. We do not know really, because the way they say, precisely because they are using their vocabulary, and the translation is problematic, they are not using Western terms, we don't really know what they mean, but that doesn't mean they didn't know what to do afterwards. And then there are other things like, for instance, recruitment. The ways they are going to recruit are, in the Americas, they match almost to perfection the descriptions that we have from West Africa at the time. How people would be threatened if they wouldn't join the movements, how people would be even killed if they refuse to join the movements. The issue of leadership is extremely important. First of all, because many of these people, and this is going to be appear in the sources time after time after time. Very often you're going to have these men, women, and children saying that they went to war because their captain from Africa, these are Spanish and Portuguese words, their captain from Africa told them to do so. So many of them actually don't have a bigger plan. They are just doing what a good soldier does, follow orders, which is quite kind of illuminating. But another argument that historians usually make about these small armies that fail is that the leaders that were flawed, the leaders that didn't know what to do. Well, in West Africa, many of them maybe were not very good leaders. But what you have to keep into consideration here is that these people go to war on the other side of Atlantic with leaders that often were not leaders on the other side of Africa, or of the Atlantic. Because this is the human capital they are left with after the Middle Passage. Okay? Even if they were the most capable leaders in Africa, they may have not made it alive to the other side. So what you have is a depleted army in any case. And to a certain extent a makeshift army in which ethnic differences usually are overcome so that they can join together. Things that wouldn't have happened in Africa. The leadership issue actually is, there are other things related to a leadership issue beyond the skills and the expertise, and it's that in the narratives that we have from these movements, usually there are clear reference to African elements, West African elements relating to leadership and often to royalty. Okay? So, for instance, the colors, they when they start these movements, usually they steal clothes from the places they ransack. And the colors are actually told in the sources. And this color always are one of three. Either white, red, or green. Green and white relate to Islam, but also relate to Ogun and to Obatala. Red is Shango. So it's very clear that they're using clothes that relate to specific traditions. But beyond that, they also steal umbrellas. In repeated occasions, they steal umbrellas. The umbrella in West Africa, in places like Dahomey, Oyo, and Nupe, at this time, they are a symbol of royalty. Not just of leadership, of royalty. People who carry umbrellas, people can only carry umbrella when they have royal blood. To the point that until the very late 18th century, when European settlers in West Africa fight against Africans and they defeat them, and they say, we capture 5 generals, they don't say we capture 5 generals. They would say, we capture 5 umbrellas. In the letter, you wouldn't see the word general, but you know they are talking about men. Or we kill an umbrella. We didn't kill an umbrella, we kill a man, we kill a general, or a prince. So these were very important symbols that show up time and again on the other side of the Atlantic. Beyond that, we also have the issue of operations and tactics, which means that, I probably mentioned that before already, that people are going to have a first-hand experience of how to make war. So, coming back to the issue of a small army, they would raise small armies in Africa, and this is what they would do, because they didn't have any other option as well in the Americas. If you are sent to a plantation, you can only plot with the people who are around you. So you start small, you grow up later on. And just as I did in Africa, they would gather weapons, or they would make the weapons, and they will use it that they would start. So they would raise these small armies at a very short time, and they would also either manufacture the weapons or gather the weapons in advance whenever possible. Now these weapons, and this is a very important bit here, some of these are recovered from Cuba, and these are engravings. They are going to match, again, weapons they had used in West Africa. But more importantly, this is the key here, these are weapons which are in disuse by this time by European and American armies. So no one in the Americas at this time was using spear in conventional warfare. And even less they were using bows and arrows, for instance. And these are very common weapons used by these people. When they cannot actually manufacture an iron spear, and let me tell you something, in West Africa, they have been manufacturing iron spears since the Iron Age. So this is not something that how do you call it? The ironmongers, ironmongers, they were some of the most important, more skillful people in West Africa. So they would rarely be sent across Atlantic. They would be kept. Even when the side was lost, they would be kept as prisoners because their skills were appreciated. That doesn't mean that some of them didn't make it across. But when they were unable to actually have these iron heads, which often they did, by the way, they would devise new ways of creating, for instance, spears. And there are descriptions that from the Americas almost match to a perfection, to a detail, descriptions from West Africa. And there is a case that I remember now of, I think it's 1840, there are slaves. What they do is that they actually find a tree, a cotton tree, ceiba, in Cuba, and they sharpen they create spears, they sharpen the end, and then they put it on fire until it's so hard that it's, and this is a description, it's harder than an iron spear. So they find a substitute to have the same end product. And they are obviously very skillful when using all of these things. Many of them, by the way, were able to use fire weapons at this time as well, because they have been exposed in West Africa. Although, for what I have seen, they were not very skillful. And the other things that they are very useful is how they go to battle. The way they prepare for battle, the way they behave in battle, they are also very similar. Like hand-to-hand combat is very common. They actually prepare for hand-to-hand combat, and they find geographical locations that allow them to exploit to the best they can the weapons they have. Since they are going to fight against organized militias that come with weapons, with guns, they actually find places where they can actually use their machetes, their cutlasses, their spears, their bows and arrows, or their rocks, whatever they have. But they find geographical locations and they actually prepare them. We see this constantly. And this happens on the other side of the Atlantic as well. This happens in West Africa as well. Finally, one thing that I want to say before I finish, and I think that this is very important, it is also overlooked very often, is the composition of the troops. Okay? Usually we think about these events as male-dominated events, and very often they are. But in West Africa, as in the Americas, women very often play important roles in warfare. Not least in the Yoruba states, or even in the Islamic Jihad, even in the Fulani Jihad, there are women who go to war. And often there are women who are leaders. And this can be also seen both in Cuba and in Bahia during this period. There are cases and there are names of women who are actually going to lead troops to battle. And they are going to be followed like any other leader would be. Some historians have claimed that in order to be able to lead troops to battle, this woman, they had to have some kind of royal blood as well. So there is always this element. But for instance, in Brazil, in Bahia, there is a woman called Seferina Nagó in 1826 that she leads an entire quilombo. We're talking about more than 100 people into battle, and everybody follows her. And she's considered to be the strongest and the scarier of all the Africans. So she's somebody who's stepping up to the front. And in Cuba, there are a number of cases, but the most famous cases are the cases of 1843 of two Lucumí African women, Ferminia and the famous Carlota, that eventually when Cuba in 1975, and I have a specialist here, so I have to be careful here. When Cuba goes to war in Angola in 1975, the operation is called Operation Carlota, after one of his slaves, who, by the way, was from West Africa, and this is West Central Africa, but anyway, it was Africa anyway. There is an interesting aspect, an interesting anecdote about this. The place where this woman led troops to battle is called the Triunvirato on Alcan Sugar Mills. This is an armed movement that is an action of war that is going to be led by 2 women and 1 man. And the Cuban Revolutionary Government in 1970-something decided to create a monument to commemorate the event, and they created 3 human figures, which happened to be 2 men and a woman. Yeah. Anyway, history repeating itself. So, to conclude, I just want to say a couple of things. First of all, I want to reinstate that I believe that these African men, women, and children are going to go through a traumatic process in the Middle Passage, but that is not going to mean that they are going to stop being who they were. They are going to continue to be the same people they were. They have to adapt to new circumstances, but they are going to find their own on the other side of the Atlantic. They are going to find a world that is not that unknown to them. They are going to be oppressed as well. But even slavery was not unknown to them. Slavery was an African institution as well. This was African. I think it's very important that we start paying more attention to the role of Africa, not only in the Age of Revolution in the Atlantic War, but in general in world history. And that we stop this historical blindness toward Africa and this implicit backwardness that is associated to Africa in general, because history is way more complicated than we are led to believe, almost always, from ancient times, by the way. I really think that when it comes to the role of Africans in the history of Latin America and the Caribbean as well, and also the United States, we are nowhere near a comfortable position to understand the real contribution. Even now, I think we are getting there, little by little, but precisely because historians continue to try to explain the actions of the Africans from a Western perspective, we continue to miss the point very often. There are people who are trying to change that now, but we continue to miss the point. And I think that it's about time that this Western historiography is challenged properly. And this is kind of what I try to get started with this book. So I'm done now. You can ask questions.
Great, thanks, Manuel.
Bye.